Yes. Yes, I can.
Cool, cool, cool. Okay. So this is just in the main shade repo. And we're going over multi-tests, which for anybody who doesn't know, for contracts, um, unit tests don't get you very far because you can only, you can't test any of like your entry point functions or basically contracts actually interacting with each other without mocking everything and kind of just cheating all the tests, which isn't that helpful. Um, so multi-test basically lets you emulate a like a pseudo blockchain environment, and you can instantiate your contracts like you normally would, and actually execute transactions and queries. So multi-test is like a CosmWasm thing that somebody else wrote, but we adapted it for Secret Network because there's a lot of nuance there. Um, but this for the Shade Protocol repo, this is the way that we um, have been doing it. We have this file where we implement, you need a contract harness for each of your contracts. So this imports the contract information. And then it uses this multi-derive implement multi, which is a macro that will create this snip20, which is your contract interface. We just, it's capitalized. And then it takes in this reference to the contract implementation. So it has access to the instantiate, execute, and query messages. We've got a bunch of commented out crap in here from old contracts. Um, but basically, once you do this, you can import your contract harness into your multi-test to instantiate all your contracts and link them and hook them up together. Let me pull up this multi-derive just so you guys can get a look at it. So this is the macro. You can see there's just some basic stuff imported, and then the multi-testable interface is the one that's needed, and this is where it builds out, just gives it the references to the entry points. And then there's also, this is something that's gotten me a few times, implement multi with reply, because when you use sub messages, you need a reply entry point also. And so this, if you ever try to do sub message multi-test and you don't use this handle, you'll just get a bunch of errors around the reply entry point. So just something to note if you're planning to use any sub messages or anything. And then let me show you an actual test for it. And this is for staking. So it's under the tests right next to source. Try to find, this is a pretty basic one. So here we import all of the multi-test stuff we need, our admin auth contract, the actual staking contract, query auth, and the SIP20. And for anyone who doesn't know, admin is a contract that we use to validate, admins for our contract, so we can set them up centrally, you know, quote unquote centrally. And then query auth is where we do our viewing key and permit verification. And then this is the actual test function with these parameters so that it can be parameterized, so that we can, have a bunch of different sets of parameters on the same test function to, really try a bunch of different numbers basically for inputs. You set up this app, which is basically like the blockchain itself. Here I'm setting, adjusting the block, what block it's at, what timestamp it is. And I do this just for consistency. Rewards emissions is kind of weird to do because you got to really manage your timestamps to make sure that you're getting consistent outputs. Then here, you generate some users, which, the address, it really doesn't care what the addresses are as long as they're unique for multi-test, which is pretty nice. You don't have to deal with actual, matching actual addresses, even though like contracts will get something generated. Here, the instantiate message for the snip20, you do this test init, which basically executes it, and then .unwrap is something that's important to do on all of these because otherwise it won't execute. Or this function will basically just like never finish, like an unresolved promise. Is how I think of it. Set the viewing key. This is a helper function for initializing that admin contract. that our contracts need for verifying admins. I don't know that you guys will be needing to use the admin auth or query auth for the hackathon, but if anybody's interested, we do have them deployed on testnet and mainnet if you wanted to get ahead. So then for the init of the test init, you give it the interface of the contract. This is the contract harness. Give it the main app or emulator blockchain. Admin label, sent funds, the basic stuff. Scrolling down, this is implementing, instantiating the staking contract. Because it gets with the matching, it gets pretty, sloppy. As you can see, like this one query is 20 lines, which is a lot. I use panics if in these cases, but asserts work in a lot of places if you're trying to do the actual value checks versus just a failure case where we got the wrong query message or query response. This is an execution, so this does the TX for staking. Then I'll scroll down to the bottom where it all gets actually ran with the parameterized. See, this test is really long. This isn't the best way to do it with just having. It's better with helper functions that so that instead of all of this balance stuff, a function that says test query balance or whatever, that it helps slim these down because this test file is really long. So then here I'm using macros. This macro basically tells it about the test. This is where the test annotation lives to tell it, don't do any of this stuff outside of tests. And then this is where you actually do the parameterization. There's something called RS test that is actually like a tool designed for this that would make this look a lot cleaner, but I haven't personally used it. But I've heard good things about it. If you don't want it to look, quite like this. But yeah, so these are all of our parameterized tests. I've got comments on the first one just to have basically a bookmark of the order of the parameters because, as you can see, it gets, once you're down here editing things, it's hard to remember which parameter is which. And I've just thrown a bunch of numbers in here to try to break the test. And then this is about how they all look. Over here, you can see these are all of the different test files. Just try to make it exhaustive. And, I've added in little one-off tests here and there for bugs that were found during testing. Just to ensure that bugs don't get re-added in later. Yeah, I think that's, unless anybody has any questions, I don't have a lot more to say about multi-test. I also don't have a good example of unit tests on hand because I usually lean on multi-test pretty heavily. Unless there's like a little math function, like if you're doing constant product and you wanted to unit test the actual math functions that takes in the parent pool amounts and gives you an output, or something that's math oriented only, doesn't include transaction or query interactions. Unit tests are fine for. So yeah, I guess any questions on that? If not, yeah, this multi-test package can be just imported through just like a GitHub in the cargo toml for use. You can import the multi-test and get access to like our interfaces so that you can interact with our contracts in your tests. And then there's also just the multi-derive where you can get these macros and just implement your own contract harnesses on your end. And then there should also be we have a lot of the libraries we used imported into our own package. But there is a central multi-test. See if I probably won't be able to find it right now. Like a multi-test that's not embedded in the shade repo, and I can find that if anybody has any questions or wants to find that. But I usually just, especially since I'm interacting with a lot of shade protocol contracts, a lot of times I just use this import from this multi-test. Yeah, I guess any questions on that? I don't know what else to go over as far as
I would say one of my biggest questions is like what I guess like what type of contracts, like let's say someone's wanting to implement this outside of the hackathon, like what types of smart contracts are multi-test best suited to help test relative to unit test. I know you like briefly touched on uh unit test only being valuable up to a certain point for various things, but like, are there contracts where you think that multi-test work exceptionally well, or some where it's less needed?
yeah, in my experience, it feels like multi-test is the best. If you're only going to have one kind of testing, I like to have multi-tests. A lot of people do these like network integration scripts where it actually runs a Docker for the secret network blockchain and then runs a script in the Docker to instantiate and run tests. And it's really slow. There's not a lot of environments you can run those in. Like if you want your tests to run on GitHub or anything like that, having GitHub spin up a Docker image for the full secret blockchain with validators is like, it's a lot. Um, and it's just clunky. So in my opinion, if you're going to have one kind of testing, multi-test is the way to go. And then unit tests for any functions that, if you using the swap function to test your math for a swap is only so reliable. You want to make sure that the math in your function works isolated. So, then you'd want a unit test for it. But yeah, I can't think of any contracts that would not work with multi-test. And if it doesn't work with multi-test, it's maybe a design issue. Um, yeah, I don't know. I hope that answered it. Um,
Yeah, no, that definitely was helpful. I had another question if anyone doesn't have any. um So I know you had mentioned that we somewhat adapted the multi-test suite for Shade. During that process, or like as you've worked with multi-tests in the past, have there been any problems that you've dealt with historically that like you've had some recent, I don't know, enlightenments of like how to get around using it or how to use it better, or just like problems you had when first starting using multi-test that you figured out how to work with a little bit better?
yeah. So let me try to find one that has some helper functions. I think that's what it's in this interface is. So having these helper functions, sometimes it's hard to do them well and generalized, and it does take a little extra time to get them. But having like the DAO that we had built, well, there's a lot of contracts involved, so we've got a pretty large init function, so we don't have to copy paste that into every multi-test. But writing these helper functions to do it helps make your tests much more readable, which is super helpful. I know I don't do it all the time because it is extra like legwork, a little extra overhead. Um, but it helps to slim down the actual test file itself a lot. Um, you making sure to use the other macro when you're this with reply anytime there's a sub message. I've ran into that before where it's the error message isn't that helpful and it takes me hours to realize I'm just using the wrong macro. That's an important one to remember. Um, and then controlling the block info and the time whenever that's when you're whenever anything relies on the timestamp or like time passing, controlling that and making it consistent is pretty critical. Which for this I always set the height to 1 because it doesn't actually care about the block. um, Setting it to something consistent at the beginning, and then when you change it, leaving it at 1 because that didn't matter. But Yeah, making sure that that's always correct. That was something that took me a little while to figure out. And then just normal testing things, making sure that you're checking all of, making sure that your arrays are the length you expect, making sure the data is right in there. Making it as exhaustive as possible. And there's one thing I should have prepared for was the code coverage tool that we use. See if I can find it in the make file. Yeah, this cargo llvm cov html is super helpful for knowing that your test coverage is good, making sure that you're hitting all your lines, making sure there's no weird edge cases that are not getting checked. Really helpful when you're writing all your tests and you want to make sure that you're not missing anything, because we've definitely had cases where once we checked code coverage that there's entire functions that aren't getting touched. Then there end up being bugs in those. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I was gonna say I know multi-tests have historically been a part of our internal audit process, and I was gonna ask if there's any other suggestions that you had for developers out there when they're looking at testing all of their code thoroughly. And yeah, I was gonna ask about any tools for like making sure that as much of the code as possible is being touched with these tests.
Yeah. I mean, the code coverage tool is definitely the best one. And it's pretty nice to get that. There's some good integrations on GitHub to have it run and check your test coverage before allowing a PR to be merged, to get the green check. But that's most of the tools that I use, and just usually run them with a cargo test. Yeah, I don't know that I use any other tools for testing aside from that. Outside of multi-test and then testnet scripting. Yeah. So if does anybody have is all that clear? Any other questions, or did I miss anything anyone was wondering about? I know multi-test and unit testing isn't the most glamorous part of development. Cool. Well, I guess no questions. You guys can always reach me on Discord in that Hackathon Mentor channel if you have any questions, or if I can cover anything for you, or anything comes up in development. I don't know how far along you guys are in development for the hackathon.